My name is Brielle Sterling, and at 31 years of age, I occupy the position of Senior Systems Architect for a leading cybersecurity firm in Boston, a role that commands an annual salary of $182,000 and requires a mind capable of deconstructing the most complex digital fortresses ever devised by man. However, all the professional prestige and technical mastery in the world could not shield me from the cold, clinical cruelty of the people I had spent my entire life calling mother and father. Last Thursday, during the biting onset of a New England winter, I found myself standing on the impeccably manicured cobblestone driveway of a $4.2 million colonial estate in the affluent suburb of Weston, Massachusetts. The sleet was a miserable 34 degrees, a freezing slurry that turned my charcoal wool cashmere coat into a heavy, damp weight against my shoulders and numbed my fingers as they gripped a $60 artisanal berry tart from Flower Bakery, which I had carefully transported as my contribution to the family dinner. I reached for the polished brass handle of the front door, expecting the usual heavy resistance of the solid oak, but instead, my hand met the unyielding rigidity of a deadbolt. I pressed the button of the Ring video doorbell, the blue LED ring glowing like a malevolent eye in the twilight, and waited for the chime to echo through the expansive foyer. Instead of the door opening to the warmth of the roaring fireplace and the scent of expensive herbs, the external intercom crackled to life with the sharp, aristocratic voice of my mother, Eleanor Sterling. She did not ask if I was cold or if the drive from the city had been treacherous. Instead, she spoke with the calculated precision of a debt collector, informing me that I was exactly 14 minutes late and that the electronic smart lock had been engaged by her phone. She told me to consider the non-refundable cost of the dinner and the wasted time as a $1,200 lesson in discipline, a punishment for my perpetual failure to meet the sterling standard of punctuality. She went so far as to suggest that I could wait in the laundry room and eat the scraps of the $450 truffle-infused turkey once the important guests had finished their meal. The humiliation was not a new sensation, but on this particular night, it felt sharper than the sleet. My parents, Eleanor and Harrison Sterling, had built their entire social identity around the narrative of the benevolent saviors who had rescued a pathetic infant from the squalor of a crack den in the inner city, a story they told with practiced humility over $190 Baccarat crystal flutes of Krug champagne at every charity gala they hosted. But as I stood there in the freezing rain, watching the warm amber light spill from the windows of a home I was no longer allowed to enter, I felt a weight in the inner pocket of my coat that Eleanor and Harrison could never have anticipated. It was a $20 Kingston encrypted USB drive, a small piece of plastic and silicon that contained the digital wreckage of the life they had stolen from me. For years, I had lived under the crushing debt of gratitude, believing I was a discarded remnant of a broken society who had been given a chance at life through their grace. I believed I was an orphan of circumstance until 3 weeks ago, when a routine deep dive into a legacy cloud server I had inherited during a corporate audit revealed a folder that shouldn't have existed. Inside that folder was a scanned image of a birth certificate from a hospital in Vermont, one that did not list me as a ward of the state, but as the biological daughter of a woman named Sarah Miller. The records didn't show a rescue. They showed a calculated legal maneuver involving a $65,000 private payment to a corrupt adoption fixer, a sum hidden behind the facade of a medical charity donation. I wasn't a charity case. I was a stolen asset, a child purchased to fill a void in a marriage that valued optics over humanity. The Sterlings had spent 3 decades molding me into a high-achieving reflection of their own success, all while reminding me of the gutter they claimed I came from. As I stood on that driveway, I could hear the muffled sound of laughter from within the house, likely the sound of my brother Julian, the golden child who never had to worry about electronic locks, joking about his latest venture capital failure. I looked down at the berry tart in my hand, the delicate raspberries now glistening with freezing rain, and I realized that the woman they thought they were disciplining no longer existed. They saw a daughter who was 14 minutes late, But I was a woman who had spent the last 72 hours decrypting every financial statement, every private email, and every hidden ledger associated with the Sterling family trust. The cold was no longer a deterrent. It was a catalyst. I walked back to my car, a 2024 midnight black Tesla Model S, the tires crunching over the thin layer of ice that was beginning to form on the driveway. I sat in the driver's seat, the interior smelling of expensive leather and the faint, lingering scent of my perfume, and I watched the dashboard display illuminate. My mind, trained to see patterns where others saw chaos, was already calculating the sequence of the coming collapse. The $65,000 secret was just the beginning of the thread. As I pulled away from the estate, the headlights cutting through the gray veil of the storm, I didn't feel the sting of the rejection or the bite of the sleet. I felt the immense, terrifying power of the truth. My name is Brielle Sterling, and while I may have been raised in a house of $4.2 million illusions, I was born into a reality that they tried to bury in a Vermont hillside. I drove toward the city, my eyes fixed on the road, while my thoughts drifted back to the early years of my childhood in that house, memories of being told to be quiet, to be grateful, to be invisible unless I was being paraded in front of their wealthy associates. I remembered the way Harrison would look at his watch when I spoke, as if my very existence was a scheduled inconvenience. I remembered the $1,200 lessons, the $500 fines for messy rooms, and the constant psychological ledger they kept of what I owed them for my life. They had treated my upbringing like a high-interest loan that could never be fully repaid, using the specter of my supposed biological origins as a whip to keep me in line. But the USB drive in my pocket was the ultimate audit. It contained the proof that the crack den narrative was a fabrication, a convenient lie designed to ensure I never looked for the mother who had actually been searching for me for 10 years before she passed away in poverty, unable to fight the legal phalanx the Sterlings had erected around me. The realization that my entire identity was a manufactured product of a $65,000 transaction felt like a physical blow to my chest, yet it provided a clarity that was almost surgical in its precision. I thought about Sarah Miller, the woman whose name was on the real birth certificate, a woman who worked as a florist and lived in a small apartment, a woman who had her child snatched by a system that favored the checkbooks of the elite over the rights of the poor. The Sterlings hadn't rescued me from a life of misery. They had robbed me of a life of love and replaced it with a cold, transactional existence where my worth was measured in billable hours and social compliance. As I navigated the wet streets of Boston, passing the glowing storefronts of Newbury Street and the towering glass monoliths of the Seaport District, I felt a sense of detachment from the world I had fought so hard to belong to. I arrived at my apartment, a minimalist loft in a converted warehouse that cost me $6,000 a month in rent, a space that was as clean and uncompromising as a line of code. I didn't take off my damp coat immediately. Instead, I went straight to my workstation, a custom-built rig with three 32-inch 4K monitors and a processing power that could crack a standard encryption in minutes. I plugged in the Kingston drive and watched the files populate the screen. There were bank transfers from 1993, correspondence with a disgraced attorney in Montpellier, and the internal memos of a private investigation firm the Sterlings had hired to track my biological mother and ensure she never made contact. Every document was a brick in the wall of their deception. I spent the next 4 hours cross-referencing the names and dates, building a timeline that would not just expose their lie, but would dismantle the very foundations of their social standing. The Sterlings prided themselves on their integrity and their philanthropic contributions to child welfare, a bitter irony that I intended to exploit to its fullest extent. I saw the records of the $450 turkey and the $1,200 fines, and I compared them to the millions they had accrued through less than ethical means, hidden in offshore accounts that my father thought were unreachable. He was a man of the old world, a man who believed that gold and mahogany were the ultimate forms of security. But he did not understand the world I lived in. In my world, secrets were just data waiting to be exfiltrated. I looked at the clock on my wall, a sleek digital display that read 11:42 p.m. The sleet had turned to a heavy, silent snow outside, blanketing the city in a deceptive peace. I thought about the laundry room scraps Eleanor had offered me and the cold tart I had left on their porch. That tart was the last thing I would ever give them. The moral of my story is that family isn't the name on a birth certificate, especially when that name was bought and paid for in a backroom deal. Family isn't the people who demand a return on their investment in your survival. Family is the truth you carry within yourself, even when that truth is a weapon that will destroy everything you once thought you loved. The Sterlings wanted to teach me a lesson in discipline, but they were the ones about to learn that when you steal a child's past, you forfeit your right to their future. I was no longer the orphan they rescued. I was the architect of their downfall, and the blueprint was already being executed. As I finally closed my laptop and stared out at the white streets of Boston, I knew that by the time the sun rose over the $4.2 million estate in Weston, the Sterling name would mean nothing more than the $65,000 crime it was built upon. The psychological architecture of the Sterling household was built entirely upon a foundation of curated financial disparity, a gap that Genevieve Sterling utilized not just as a lifestyle choice, but as a calibrated weapon of domestic warfare designed to keep me in a perpetual state of perceived debt. To the outside world, Genevieve was a paragon of enlightened grace, a woman who sought the highest vibrations of the universe through her monthly $9,500 investment in spiritual coaching sessions with a celebrity guru based in Ojai, California, whose primary philosophy seemed to involve teaching wealthy women how to manifest more wealth while ignoring the suffering of those in their immediate proximity. She would sit in her sun-drenched morning room, surrounded by $2,000 amethyst geodes and the scent of hand-poured diptyque baize candles that cost $75 each, discussing the alignment of her chakras and the flow of her cosmic energy, all while I was being systematically punished for the crime of my very existence. While she was ascending to higher planes of consciousness on the family's dime, I was struggling to maintain the most basic semblance of a functional life, forced for 4 grueling years to commute to my first junior architecture firm in a 2012 metallic gray Toyota Corolla that was slowly dying a mechanical death right in front of my eyes. The car was a rolling embarrassment, characterized by a persistent, sweet-smelling cloud of steam that hissed from a leaking radiator I couldn't afford to fully replace on my starting salary, forcing me to keep gallon jugs of Preston antifreeze in the trunk and stop every 15 miles to top off the reservoir just to prevent the engine from seizing on the Massachusetts Turnpike. The contrast between my reality and theirs was never more stark than during our mandatory holiday gatherings, which Genevieve treated not as celebrations of family, but as high-stakes performance reviews where my worth was measured against the exorbitant luxury of my sister Skylar. Skylar was the biological golden child, the genetic miracle who could do no wrong in the eyes of the Sterlings, and her path through life was paved with the kind of frictionless ease that only comes from a $290,000 medical school tuition paid in full, up front, in cold hard cash from the family's liquid assets. While Skylar moved through the halls of Harvard Medical School without a single financial care, selecting her specialty with the leisure of a socialite picking out a gala dress, I was suffocating under the crushing weight of $84,300 in private student loans that I had been forced to take out at predatory interest rates because Eleanor and Harrison had flatly refused to co-sign for me, claiming that I needed to understand the value of $1 and prove my independence. Every morning at the estate, the ritual began with a mandatory 7 o'clock breakfast in the formal dining room, a cold, cavernous space where the air always felt thin and the silence was only broken by the clinking of sterling silver against bone china. If I arrived even 60 seconds late, or if my attire didn't meet Genevieve's exacting standards of quiet luxury, the verbal flaying would begin before the organic, free-range egg whites were even served. Genevieve had a particular talent for the subtle barb, a way of looking at my feet and sighing with a theatrical disappointment if I wasn't wearing $400 Jimmy Choo Romy pumps or a similar brand that signaled I belonged to her social strata. She would lean back in her chair, adjusting the 12-carat sapphire ring on her finger that probably cost more than my entire 4-year degree, and remind me in a voice as smooth as silk that my gutter heritage was showing. A recurring theme she used to remind me that no matter how many systems I architected or how much I earned, I was still the child of the crack den in her narrative. She spoke about my biological origins as if they were a stain that no amount of expensive education could ever fully wash away, using my financial struggles and my aging Toyota as proof that I lacked the inherent breeding to handle real success. Meanwhile, Skylar sat across from me, draped in a $3,000 Loro Piana cashmere wrap, receiving praise for her mediocre grades, while my mother calculated the cost of my failures in the currency of her own ego. The financial gap was a constant, suffocating presence, a reminder that I was a guest in their lives, a temporary project that they could terminate at any moment if I didn't perform the role of the grateful, disciplined charity case to their satisfaction. The spiritual coaching sessions that Genevieve touted as her path to enlightenment were, in reality, just another layer of the expensive armor she wore to protect herself from the truth of what she had done to me. A way to justify the $65,000 purchase of a child by framing it as a karmic rescue mission. She would spend hours talking about the importance of releasing negative energy, yet she held on to her resentment toward my biological mother with a grip like iron, ensuring that every cent spent on my upbringing was recorded in a mental ledger that she expected me to pay back with a lifetime of subservience. I remember one specific morning when the radiator on the Corolla finally gave out completely in the middle of a January blizzard, leaving me stranded on the side of I-95 while I was trying to make it to that 7 o'clock breakfast. And when I finally called the house from a tow truck, Genevieve didn't ask if I was safe or if I had a way home. Instead, she informed me that since I had missed the breakfast window, my presence was no longer required for the day, and that she would be deducting the cost of the wasted catering from the small allowance they occasionally gave me for family-related expenses. It was a $1,200 penalty for an act of God, a fine for the audacity of being poor in a household of unimaginable wealth. The cruelty of their financial gatekeeping was most evident in the way they treated my student loans, which had become a literal noose around my professional neck, preventing me from moving out of my tiny, overpriced apartment or investing in the tools I needed to advance my career at the pace my talent deserved. Harrison Sterling, a man who managed a hedge fund with assets totaling over $500 million, would sit in his leather-bound library sipping a 50-year-old Macallan Scotch and lecture me on the virtues of fiscal responsibility, telling me that the $84,000 I owed to the bank was a healthy incentive to work harder. He said this while looking at a painting on his wall that he had purchased for 3 times that amount at a Sotheby's auction the previous month, a vibrant, abstract piece that he only bought because he wanted to outbid a rival in the shipping industry. To them, my debt wasn't a burden. It was a leash, a way to ensure that I was always looking up at them from the bottom of a financial hole they had helped dig. They wanted me to be successful enough to be a credit to their name in public, but never so successful that I could afford to walk away from their table without asking for permission. As I navigated the complexities of being a senior systems architect, earning a salary that would have been a fortune to anyone else but was pocket change to the Sterlings, I began to realize that the discipline Genevieve talked about was just a code word for total control. The $1,200 lessons, the $500 fines for perceived slights, and the constant reminders of the gutter were all designed to erode my sense of self-worth until I believed that I was truly lucky to be there. I spent my days designing intricate security protocols for multi-billion-dollar corporations, protecting their data from the most sophisticated threats in the world, while my own life was being hacked and manipulated by the 2 people who were supposed to be my primary firewall. I started keeping a secret ledger of my own, a digital file where I tracked every dollar they spent on Skylar versus every dollar they withheld from me, every luxury they flaunted while I was pouring antifreeze into a dying car, and every time they used my supposed orphan status as a psychological bludgeon. The contrast between Genevieve's spiritual aspirations and her material cruelty was a hypocrisy that I began to document with the same precision I used to debug a faulty server, recognizing that her $9,500 monthly coaching was nothing more than a high-priced indulgence to soothe a conscience that should have been screaming. She didn't want to be a better person. She wanted to be a person who felt good about being terrible. Every time she mentioned my gutter heritage, she was reinforcing the wall between us, ensuring that I stayed in my place as the grateful recipient of her filtered benevolence. But she didn't realize that the senior systems architect she had inadvertently created was no longer looking for her approval. She was looking for her vulnerabilities. I was analyzing the Sterling family trust with a cold architectural focus, finding the cracks in their financial facade that they thought were hidden behind their $4.2 million estate and their crystal flutes. The $84,000 in loans, the leaking radiator, and the $400 shoes were all just data points in a much larger system that I was preparing to shut down. I was no longer the girl in the 2012 Corolla. I was a woman who knew exactly how much every lie they told had cost me, and I was about to send them the final bill. The moral of this chapter of my life is that those who use money to measure the value of a human soul are usually the ones whose own souls have the lowest market value. Family isn't a ledger where you balance the cost of a turkey against the discipline of a daughter, and it certainly isn't a spiritual journey funded by the exploitation of a child's past. Genevieve and Harrison thought they were teaching me the value of $1, but they were actually teaching me the value of their destruction. They showed me that wealth can buy a $4.2 million colonial in Weston and a $290,000 medical degree for a golden child, but it can't buy the silence of someone who has finally learned how to read the fine print of their own life. As the sleet turned to ice on the windshield of my mind, I realized that the financial gap they used as a weapon was about to become the very thing that swallowed them whole, leaving me standing in the wreckage with a $20 USB drive and a truth that no amount of spiritual coaching could ever manifest away. The clock on the wall of Genevieve's private art gallery, a climate-controlled sanctuary filled with $17 million worth of contemporary minimalism and silent judgment, read exactly 2:14 p.m. on a Tuesday that would forever serve as the point of no return for the identity I had spent 31 years inhabiting. I was not there as a guest or a daughter, but as a technical convenience, perched on a sleek $3,000 carbon fiber stepladder to recalibrate the high-definition Nest security cameras that monitored her collection of overpriced canvas and ego. My hands, steady from years of navigating complex server architectures, were adjusting the focal length of a lens when my hip brushed against a concealed pressure plate hidden behind a silk-screened floral wallpaper that cost $200 per square foot. To anyone else, the faint mechanical whir that followed would have been imperceptible, but to a systems architect trained to hear the binary heartbeat of a building, it was the sound of a $12,000 antique floor safe, an 1890s S.H. Terwilliger masterpiece that had been retrofitted with a silent electronic release, sliding open beneath a loose floorboard of reclaimed French oak. I climbed down the ladder, my breath hitching in my throat as the dark mahogany lid of the floor cavity gaped open like a hungry mouth, revealing not the expected stacks of gold bullion or the glimmer of Genevieve's insured jewelry collection, but a weathered manila expansion folder that looked violently out of place in this room of sterile perfection. I knelt on the floor, the coldness of the polished wood seeping through my trousers, and pulled the folder into the harsh light of the gallery's track lighting, feeling a sense of impending architectural collapse within my own mind. Inside, there was no legal adoption decree, no notarized state documents, and no benevolent correspondence from an agency. Instead, the first thing that greeted me was a 1995 police file from the Denver Police Department, its edges yellowed and brittle, bearing a bold, red-stamped header that screamed kidnapping alert. Beneath the stamp was a grainy, high-contrast black-and-white surveillance photo of a woman standing outside a corner grocery store, and as I stared at the image, the world seemed to tilt on its axis, because the woman in the photograph possessed my exact, distinctive jawline, the same slight arch in the left eyebrow, and the same haunted, intelligent depth in eyes that I saw every single morning in my own bathroom mirror. This woman was Maya Rossi, a name that resonated through my consciousness like a frequency I had been tuned to since birth, but had never been allowed to hear. A name that represented a life and a lineage that had been systematically erased by the people who claimed they had rescued me from the gutter. Attached to the police report with a rusted silver paperclip was a handwritten ledger on heavy, cream-colored executive stationery, the unmistakable, arrogant script of my father, Harrison Sterling, flowing across the page with the casual indifference of a man recording a routine business transaction. The entry was dated October 14, 1995, and it read with a chilling surgical precision that made my skin crawl. Final wire to the clinic, $65,000. All biological traces incinerated. Maya is now Brielle. The words were a death sentence for the girl I thought I was, and a resurrection for the victim I actually was, proving that the $65,000 they had always held over my head as the cost of my salvation was actually the purchase price for my abduction. They hadn't navigated the difficult, noble path of adoption to provide a home for a child in need. They had engaged in a cold-blooded human procurement, buying me from a corrupt nurse at a private clinic in Colorado and using Harrison's immense financial influence to ensure that the existence of Maya Rossi was deleted from every official database while they rebranded me as Brielle Sterling. The realization that my entire history was a manufactured product, a $65,000 asset bought for the price of a mid-size SUV or a single year of Skylar's elite private schooling, felt like a physical weight crushing my lungs as I sat there in the silence of the gallery. For 3 decades, Eleanor and Genevieve had performed the role of the righteous saviors, using my supposed gutter heritage as a psychological leash to ensure my total obedience, all while they held the evidence of their own felony in a floor safe beneath their feet. I began to flip through the rest of the file with trembling fingers, finding copies of forged birth certificates, receipts for private investigators who had been paid to harass and silence any inquiries into the Denver kidnapping, and a series of encrypted memos regarding the incinerated medical records mentioned in Harrison's ledger. They hadn't just stolen a child, they had committed a multi-decade conspiracy to maintain the illusion of their own morality, building a $4.2 million life on top of a grave they had dug for my real mother's memory. As a senior systems architect, I understood the concept of a corrupted kernel, a fundamental error at the very center of an operating system that eventually leads to a total system failure, and I realized that the Sterling family was that corrupted kernel. Every holiday performance review, every $1,200 lesson in discipline, and every $9,500 spiritual coaching session was a layer of code designed to hide the original sin of my purchase. I looked back at the photo of the woman in Denver, the real Maya Rossi, and I wondered if she was still out there, if she had spent the last 28 years looking for the daughter who had been turned into a Sterling, or if the incinerated traces Harrison wrote about included her very life. The financial gap that Genevieve used as a weapon was now laughable. She had spent more on her Ojai manifestos in a single year than it had cost to buy my entire future, and yet she had the audacity to lecture me on the breeding and heritage I supposedly lacked. I pulled out my phone, a high-end device with military-grade encryption that I had configured myself, and began to systematically photograph every single page in the Rossi file, the shutter sound of the camera echoing through the gallery like a series of tiny digital gunshots. I captured the Denver police stamp, the handwritten ledger with Harrison's signature, the wire transfer confirmation for the $65,000, and the grainy photo of the woman who gave me my face. I was no longer recalibrating cameras for their security. I was building an evidentiary fortress that would dismantle their lives with the same cold architectural efficiency they had used to dismantle mine. I could hear the muffled sound of Genevieve's voice from the foyer, her tone bright and performative as she spoke to a delivery driver about a $1,200 floral arrangement for her upcoming garden club luncheon. and the sheer banality of her evil made me feel a cold, crystalline rage that I had never known before. She was worried about the placement of peonies while I was holding the records of my own kidnapping, a juxtaposition that highlighted the sociopathic disconnect of the wealthy elite who believe that everything, even a human soul, has a market price that can be negotiated and then forgotten. I carefully replaced the folder in the antique floor safe, ensuring that every document was aligned exactly as I had found it, and used the electronic release to slide the floorboard back into place, the French oak clicking home with a sickeningly smooth finality. I climbed back up the carbon fiber ladder, my hands no longer trembling, and finished the recalibration of the security cameras, ensuring that the new angles provided a perfect, unobstructed view of the gallery floor, including the loose board above the safe. I was the architect of their security, but I was now the administrator of their destruction, and I had just gained root access to the darkest secrets of the Sterling legacy. The $65,000 secret wasn't just a skeleton in their closet, it was the foundation of their entire house, and I knew that once I pulled that thread, the $4.2 million estate, the $182,000 debt of gratitude, and the Jimmy Choo lifestyle would all come crashing down in a spectacular display of digital and legal ruin. I thought about the 34-degree sleet storm from the previous Thursday and the electronic lock that had kept me out, and I realized that the lock hadn't been a punishment for me. It had been a mercy for them. A few more days of ignorance before I walked back into their lives as the ghost they thought they had incinerated in 1995. My name is Brielle Sterling for now, but my blood belongs to a woman named Maya Rossi, who was robbed of her daughter by a man with a checkbook and a woman with a spiritual coach. And the moral of this story is that you can never truly delete a biological trace, no matter how much you pay to burn the records. Data has a way of surviving the fire, and when the architect of the system decides to turn against the owners, there is no encryption in the world that can keep the truth from being broadcast. I descended the ladder for the last time, packing my technical gear into my professional messenger bag with a deliberate, rhythmic, slow-motion intensity, feeling the $20 Kingston USB drive in my pocket as if it were a thermal detonator. I walked out of the gallery, past Genevieve, who didn't even look up from her floral arrangement to acknowledge my departure, and as I stepped out into the crisp autumn air of Weston, I felt a sense of liberation that was almost overwhelming. The financial weapons they had used against me, the student loans, the Corolla with the leaking radiator, the Jimmy Choo performance reviews, were all rendered obsolete by the sheer weight of the crime I had uncovered. They wanted to teach me a $1,200 lesson in discipline, but I was about to give them a $65,000 education in justice, and the curriculum was going to be televised through every court and news outlet in the country. I was no longer a ward of the Sterling state. I was a sovereign entity with a police file from Denver and a jawline that proved I was never theirs to own. As I started the engine of my Tesla, the silent electric power ready to propel me back to the city, I looked at the estate one last time through the rearview mirror, knowing that the next time I saw these walls, they would be stripped of their luxury and revealed for the prison they truly were. The point of no return had been crossed at 2:14 p.m., and the countdown to the total erasure of the Sterling name had officially begun. I sat in the confined, frigid interior of my 2012 metallic gray Toyota Corolla at exactly 6:58 p.m., feeling the rhythmic, unsettling rattle of an engine that was struggling against the plummeting New England temperature and the persistent, slow leak of a radiator that hissed like a dying animal. The dashboard clock, a dim liquid crystal display that flickered with a weary green light, ticked toward the hour that usually signaled my mandatory appearance at the Sterling dinner table. But for the first time in 31 years, the psychological tether that had kept me bound to their expectations had snapped with a violent, liberating finality. I looked through the condensation on my windshield at the frosted glass of the formal dining room in the Weston estate, where the warm, amber glow of $3,000 Murano glass chandeliers spilled out onto the freshly fallen snow, creating an illusion of domestic sanctuary that I now understood to be a high-end facade for a criminal enterprise. For my entire conscious life, I had been conditioned to believe that I was the lucky one, the chosen orphan who had been plucked from a path of certain misery and elevated to a world of Ivy League ambitions and $400 Jimmy Choo performance reviews. But as I clutched the steering wheel, I realized that my existence in that house was never an act of grace. I was not a daughter or even a project of benevolence. I was a victim of a high-end human trafficking deal, a $65,000 asset whose biological heritage had been incinerated to satisfy the vanity of a hedge fund manager, and a woman who spent $9,500 a month on spiritual coaching to drown out the screams of her own conscience. The realization was a cold, surgical blade cutting through the decades of manipulated gratitude, stripping away the sterling name until all that was left was the raw, undeniable truth of the Denver police file and the woman with my exact jawline who had been robbed of her child. I did not step out of the car to knock on the heavy oak door, and I certainly did not intend to beg for entry into a home that was built on the wreckage of my real mother's life. Nor did I care about the $1,200 lesson in discipline that Eleanor was undoubtedly preparing to deliver from behind her electronic smart lock. Instead, I pulled out my high-end smartphone, my thumb hovering over the screen as I accessed the digital copies of the documents I had exfiltrated from the antique floor safe in Genevieve's gallery, and I focused on a specific 24-year-old address located in a modest working-class suburb of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. It was a residence listed in the private investigator's report, the last known location where a woman named Sarah Miller had tried to rebuild a life after her daughter, Maya Rossi, had vanished into the calculated silence of the Sterling's legal machine. My hands, which should have been shaking from the sheer magnitude of the betrayal, were instead preternaturally steady as I entered the coordinates into the GPS, the blue line of the route stretching out like a lifeline across the digital map of the Northeast. I shifted the rattling Toyota into drive, the transmission clunking with a heavy mechanical protest that echoed the structural collapse of my relationship with the people in that $4.2 million house. As I pulled away from the curb, the headlights of the Corolla cutting through the gray veil of the winter twilight, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw the Weston estate receding into the distance, its sprawling silhouette looking less like a mansion and more like a tomb for the girl I used to be. I was done being the grateful project for a couple of sophisticated criminals who used their wealth to sanitize the theft of a human being, and I was finished paying off the $84,300 in student loans for an education that was meant to make me a better servant to their legacy. The financial gap they had used as a weapon for 30 years was now a bridge I was burning behind me, and as the engine temperature gauge hovered dangerously close to the red line, I didn't feel fear. I felt an incinerating purpose that no amount of sterling influence could extinguish. I was driving toward a ghost, toward a past that had been bought and paid for in 1995, and toward a woman who might still be waiting for the daughter that Harrison Sterling thought he could delete with a $65,000 wire transfer. The journey ahead was more than 300 miles of dark highways and freezing rain, a physical manifestation of the distance I needed to put between myself and the manufactured identity of Brielle Sterling. I thought about the $3,000 Loro Piana wraps and the $190 Baccarat crystal flutes, and I realized they were nothing more than shiny distractions designed to keep me from looking at the blood on the floorboards of my own history. Every time Genevieve had mentioned my gutter heritage, she was projecting her own moral rot onto me, ensuring that I felt too small to ever question the origin of my arrival in their lives. The rattling of the Corolla's engine became a war drum in my ears, a reminder that while they had the black 2024 Chevrolet Tahoe and the unlimited liquid assets, I had the one thing that Harrison's hedge fund could never buy, the raw, unencrypted data of their crimes. I reached into my pocket and felt the cool, rectangular shape of the $20 Kingston USB drive, a small piece of hardware that contained enough explosive information to dismantle the Sterling family trust and send the benevolent saviors of Weston to a federal holding cell. As I hit the Mass Pike, the city lights of Boston beginning to fade into a blur of neon and salt-stained asphalt, I felt a sense of clarity that was almost transcendental, a level of consciousness that Genevieve's $9,500 gurus could never hope to achieve. I was no longer an architect of systems for corporations. I was the architect of a new reality, one where Maya Rossi was not a cold case in a Denver police file, but a living, breathing woman with a right to know that her daughter had survived the fire. The Sterlings had spent 31 years trying to mold me into a high-achieving reflection of their own narcissism, but they had accidentally given me the technical skills and the analytical mind necessary to deconstruct them with surgical precision. They wanted a disciplined daughter, but they had created a relentless investigator, and as I pushed the aging Toyota through the night, I knew that the 14-minute delay Eleanor had punished me for was just the beginning of a much longer wait she was about to endure for a forgiveness that would never come. The road to Pittsburgh was a gauntlet of memory and rage, each mile marker a step further away from the $4.2 million illusion and a step closer to the working-class reality of Sarah Miller. I thought about the $450 truffle turkey and the $60 berry tart I had left on their doorstep, symbols of a life where love was always transactional and affection was a line item in a budget. I was leaving behind the world of quiet luxury for a world of loud truths, trading the Jimmy Choos for the grit of a Pennsylvania winter, because the truth doesn't care about the brand of your shoes or the vintage of your champagne. My name is Brielle Sterling for the last few hours of this drive, but by the time I reach that suburb in Pittsburgh, I intend to be the woman I was born to be, the daughter who was never an orphan, never a rescue, and never, ever their property. The moral of the story is that you can buy a child, you can buy a legal system, and you can buy a narrative, but you can never buy the silence of the human spirit once it finds the key to its own cage. The electronic lock is engaged, but this time it's keeping them in their gilded prison while I drive toward the only home I've ever truly had, and the price of this lesson is a cost the Sterlings will be paying for the rest of their miserable, fraudulent lives. I passed through the toll booths of the New York border, the sleet turning into a steady, rhythmic snow that blanketed the world in a deceptive quiet. But inside the Corolla, the heat was cranked to the maximum, and my mind was a furnace of strategic calculation. I visualized the handwritten ledger in the floor safe, the $65,000 figure etched in Harrison's arrogant hand, and I realized that every cent of my success was a defiance of his plan. He wanted me to be a senior systems architect so I could be a credit to his name, but I was going to use those skills to wipe that name off the social map of New England. I would find Sarah Miller, or I would find her grave, and I would lay the Sterling legacy upon it like a sacrificial offering to the mother who had her world stolen by a man with a checkbook. The engine continued its rhythmic rattling, a mechanical heartbeat that refused to give up, much like the biological traces that Harrison thought he had incinerated in a Colorado clinic decades ago. I was the trace that survived, the data point that couldn't be deleted, and the asset that was about to liquidate the entire Sterling empire with a single encrypted upload. As the hours bled into one another and the landscape shifted from the affluent suburbs of the coast to the industrial silhouettes of the interior, I felt the weight of the $84,000 in loans and the $1,200 fines lifting off my chest. Those were the debts of a girl who didn't know who she was. But the woman behind the wheel of this rattling Toyota owed the Sterlings nothing but the cold, hard exposure of their truth. I reached for my coffee, now cold and bitter in the cup holder of my aging car, and I drank it with the satisfaction of someone who has finally tasted freedom, a flavor more complex and enduring than any $190 bottle of Krug. I was no longer a ward of the state or a ward of the Sterlings. I was a sovereign woman on a collision course with my own history, and I didn't need their permission, their money, or their Jimmy Choos to complete the journey. The point of no return was 300 miles back in a gallery in Weston, and the destination was a house in Pittsburgh where the truth was waiting to be told in a language that the Sterlings would never understand. I was Maya Rossi's daughter, and I was coming home to reclaim the 31 years that had been stolen from us, 1 mile of frozen highway at a time. The drive toward Pennsylvania was not a flight of desperation, but a calculated deployment of resources, a transition from being the hunted to becoming the hunter as I utilized every technical and financial asset at my disposal to construct an unassailable arsenal of truth. While the 2012 Toyota Corolla rattled through the night, its engine fighting the 30-degree cold, my mind was operating at the peak efficiency of a senior systems architect, organizing data points into a lethal narrative that would leave the sterling legacy in ashes. To ensure the structural integrity of my findings, I didn't rely solely on the documents I had exfiltrated from the floor safe in Weston. Instead, I reached out to a specialist in New York, a private investigator who commanded a fee of $3,400 for 48 hours of intensive labor, a man whose entire career was dedicated to the high-stakes world of cold case reunions and illicit adoptions. He was a ghost in the machine, a man who knew how to bypass the sanitized layers of corporate filings that Harrison Sterling used to hide his tracks, and within 6 hours of my initial wire transfer, he had unearthed the definitive paper trail that the Sterlings thought had been incinerated in 1995. The evidence he provided was a sequence of 3 distinct offshore transfers originating from a shell corporation in the Cayman Islands, each for the exact amount of $21,666.67, totaling the $65,000 purchase price mentioned in my father's handwritten ledger. These transfers were timed with a terrifying rhythmic precision, hitting a private account in Denver, Colorado, exactly 48 hours before, 24 hours after, and 10 days following the date I was officially declared a Sterling. It was the financial heartbeat of a kidnapping, a cold and calculated transaction that treated my life like a piece of high-end real estate rather than a human soul. I spent the next several hours in a fluorescent-lit service station off I-80, using my mobile workstation to compile these records alongside the original 1995 Denver Police Department kidnapping alert for Maya Rossi, creating a digital and physical dossier that bridged the gap between the girl I was told I was and the victim I actually am. To provide the final, undeniable kill shot to their 31-year deception, I reached into the hidden compartment of my professional messenger bag and pulled out the results of a DNA comparison test I had secretly initiated 10 days prior, a process that had cost me an additional $1,400 for an expedited laboratory analysis. A week before I was locked out in the 34-degree sleet, I had taken a handful of silver blonde strands from Genevieve's $500 Mason Pearson hairbrush, which she kept on her Carrara marble vanity, and submitted them alongside my own cheek swab. The lab report, printed on heavy, official stationery that felt like a death warrant in my hands, stated the biological reality with a cold, mathematical finality, a 0% probability of maternity. There was no shared genetic markers, no hidden heritage, and no biological link to the woman who spent $9,500 a month on spiritual coaching while reminding me of my supposed gutter heritage. I was a genetic stranger in the house where I had been raised, a biological anomaly purchased to satisfy the vanity of 2 people who valued their social standing more than the law or human rights. I took these disparate pieces of evidence, the police report, the wire transfer receipts, the private investigator's findings, and the DNA results, and meticulously organized them into a $90 professional black leather portfolio I had purchased specifically for this confrontation. This wasn't just a collection of papers, it was a weaponized history, a structural blueprint of a crime that spanned 3 decades and 2,000 miles. I placed the grainy black and white surveillance photo of Sarah Miller, the woman with my jawline, at the very front of the portfolio, ensuring that her face would be the first thing anyone saw when the folder was opened. I felt a sense of crystalline purpose as I smoothed the leather cover, a feeling that was far removed from the crushing weight of the $84,300 in student loans or the $1,200 lessons in discipline that Genevieve had used to keep me small. I was no longer an architect of digital systems. I was the architect of the Sterling's total and irreversible destruction, and I was carrying the explosives in a $90 leather case on the passenger seat of a dying Toyota. The financial disparity they had used to manipulate me for years was now working in my favor, as my $182,000 salary had provided me with the capital to buy the truth that they had spent millions to hide. I thought about the $3,400 I had paid the investigator and realized it was the best investment I had ever made, a far better return than any hedge fund Harrison had ever managed. As I drove, the heater in the Corolla finally began to fail, the air turning tepid and stale, but the cold didn't bother me because the rage burning in my chest was providing more than enough warmth. I was imagining the look on Harrison's face when he saw the 3 transfers of $21,666, the exact figures he thought were buried in an offshore abyss. And I was anticipating the moment Genevieve realized that her $9,500 spiritual manifestations could not manifest her way out of a kidnapping charge. They had spent 31 years performing the roles of the benevolent saviors, but they had neglected the most basic rule of any secure system. The greatest threat is always the one you allow inside the perimeter. I was the ultimate insider threat, a senior systems architect who had been given access to the most intimate details of their lives, and I was now using that access to exfiltrate the truth of my own origin. The arsenal was complete, the tactical plan was in place, and the destination in Pittsburgh was drawing closer with every rotation of the Toyota's struggling wheels. I looked at the leather portfolio and felt a strange, detached sense of pride in the work I had done. It was the most complex project of my life, a deconstruction of a manufactured reality that required the same precision I used to debug a multi-billion-dollar corporate network. There were no bugs in this dossier, no vulnerabilities that they could exploit, and no legal defense that could withstand the combined weight of the DNA evidence and the financial trail. I was bringing the ghost of Maya Rossi back to life, and I was doing it with a $20 USB drive and a $90 portfolio that contained the evidence of a $65,000 sin. The moral of this journey is that when you build a life on a foundation of lies, you are simply waiting for someone with the right tools to come along and find the cracks. The Sterlings thought they were the masters of their domain, using money to bridge the gaps in their morality and fine wine to toast their own perceived righteousness, but they had forgotten that debt always comes due, and the interest on a stolen life is astronomical. Family isn't a performance review conducted at a 7 o'clock breakfast, and it isn't a $65,000 wire transfer to a corrupt clinic. Family is the truth that survives even when you try to incinerate the traces. I was the trace that survived the fire, the biological data that couldn't be deleted, and the senior systems architect who was about to crash the entire Sterling operating system without any possibility of a reboot. As the skyline of Pittsburgh began to emerge through the winter haze, a silhouette of steel and grit that matched my own resolve, I reached over and tapped the leather cover of the portfolio, a silent promise to the woman in the grainy photo that the silence was finally over. I thought about the 2012 Toyota Corolla and the way Genevieve had looked at it with such profound disgust, as if the car's mechanical failings were a reflection of my own character. And I smiled at the irony that this rattling, leaking vehicle was the chariot of her undoing. The Jimmy Choos she wanted me to wear were designed for a woman who followed the rules, but the person behind the wheel of this Toyota was a woman who was about to rewrite the entire rulebook of the Sterling family. I was no longer afraid of the electronic locks or the $1,200 fines because I had gained root access to the truth. And in the world of systems architecture, root access is God mode. I was driving toward a suburb in Pittsburgh where the echoes of 1995 were still waiting to be heard, and I was bringing an arsenal of $65,000 receipts and 0% DNA matches to ensure that the message was received loud and clear. The point of no return was far behind me, and the destination was no longer just a house, but a confrontation with the reality of a stolen identity that would finally allow Brielle Sterling to die so that Maya Rossi's daughter could finally live. The arsenal was ready, the hunter was on the doorstep, and the sterling legacy was about to be liquidated in a spectacular display of digital and biological justice. The architectural layout of the Weston estate had been transformed for the annual Founders Gala, a high-stakes theatrical production of philanthropy and ego, where the sterling name was polished to a blinding shine for the benefit of 65 of the most influential power players in Massachusetts. I knew the schedule of this event with the precision of a seasoned operative because I had spent my youth being the invisible stagehand for Eleanor and Harrison's social triumphs, and I knew that Saturday at 8 o'clock was the precise moment when the $300 a plate catering, featuring pan-seared Wagyu beef and microgreen salads harvested from a local organic farm, would be cleared to make way for the keynote address. I arrived at the front gates at exactly 8:05 p.m., driving my 2024 midnight black Tesla Model S instead of the rattling Toyota, a deliberate choice of optics to signal that the senior systems architect was no longer a subordinate, but a peer with her own capital. I was wearing a $1,500 charcoal power suit from Theory, tailored with such surgical precision that it felt like a suit of armor, and I walked toward the towering mahogany double doors of the house with a level of calm that only comes from knowing you hold the master encryption key to someone else's destruction. I didn't use the back laundry room entrance where Eleanor had once suggested I eat turkey scraps, nor did I wait for the electronic smart lock to grant me passage. Instead, I walked through the main entrance, my heels clicking a steady rhythmic cadence against the marble foyer that sounded like the ticking of a countdown clock. The air inside the house was thick with the scent of $5,000 floral arrangements consisting of rare white orchids and Casablanca lilies, a cloying sweetness that attempted to mask the sterile, transactional coldness of the people gathered within. As I moved through the crowd, I saw the familiar faces of the Weston elite, people who had watched me grow up and had nodded with practiced pity whenever Eleanor told the story of my rescue from the inner city gutter. I was holding the $90 professional black leather portfolio tucked under my arm, feeling its weight like a physical detonator that was wired directly into the structural integrity of the Sterling Family Trust. I passed the long tables draped in Belgian linen where guests sipped from $190 Baccarat crystal flutes, their laughter tinkling like breaking glass, and I headed straight for the sunken ballroom where the podium had been set up beneath a massive oil painting of Harrison's great-grandfather. Genevieve saw me first, her eyes widening behind her designer glasses as she registered my presence, her face pale against the backdrop of her $12,000 sapphire necklace. She moved toward me with the predatory grace of a socialite whose territory had been breached, her voice dropping into a low, venomous hiss as she reached my side, demanding to know why I was there and ordering me to leave immediately through the service exit before I embarrassed the family in front of the local press. I didn't flinch or retreat. I simply smiled at her with a terrifyingly clear sense of detachment, a look that conveyed I was no longer a variable she could manipulate in her spiritual manifesting sessions. I walked past her, ignoring the frantic clutch of her hand on my sleeve, and stepped up onto the mahogany dais, the elevated platform giving me a panoramic view of the 65 guests who represented the very fabric of the Sterling's manufactured reality. The local press photographer from the Weston Gazette was poised with his camera, and I could see Harrison at the back of the room, frozen mid-conversation with a state senator, his glass of 50-year-old Macallan Scotch trembling slightly in his hand. I reached out and tapped the silver neck of the Shure microphone on the podium, the sharp, hollow thud echoing through the $4.2 million estate and cutting through the ambient noise of the gala like a gunshot in a library. The room fell into a sudden, vacuum-like silence as the senior systems architect took center stage, not as a daughter or a charity case, but as the administrator of a long-overdue system crash. I opened the black leather portfolio, the grainy 1995 Denver police report resting on top, and I felt the $65,000 secret vibrating in the air between us, a digital ghost that had finally found a voice. Genevieve's spiritual coaching had taught her how to manifest light, but it had never taught her how to handle the sudden, blinding exposure of the dark, and as she stood at the foot of the podium, She looked small and fragile in her $400 Jimmy Choo pumps. I looked directly at Harrison, whose face had shifted from a mask of aristocratic boredom to a pale, sweating realization of his own vulnerability, and I realized that the financial gap he had used as a weapon for 31 years was now the very distance that would prevent him from reaching the stage in time to stop me. The local press began to lean in, sensing a story that was far more compelling than a routine philanthropic report, their lenses focusing on the professional dossier I was spreading out across the lectern. I felt a surge of crystalline power as I adjusted the microphone, the feedback a high-pitched whine that seemed to signal the final collapse of the Sterling operating system. I was the architect of their security, the one who knew every backdoor and every hidden safe, and I was about to execute the final command that would delete the Sterling name from the social register and replace it with the cold, hard data of a kidnapping alert for Maya Rossi. The moral of this moment was that you should never teach the child you stole how to deconstruct complex systems, because eventually she will turn those tools on the foundation of the house you built around her. I stood there, the charcoal wool of my suit absorbing the glare of the chandeliers, and I prepared to speak the truth into the silence of their $4.2 million illusion, knowing that once the first word was uttered, there would be no recovery, no backup, and no restoration of the life they had purchased for $65,000. Every $1,200 lesson in discipline, every $9,500 monthly coaching session, and every $84,000 in unpaid student loans had led to this singular point of convergence, a tactical strike on the heart of the Sterling legacy. I was no longer Brielle, the rescued orphan. I was the forensic evidence of their greatest crime, and I was broadcasting the results of my audit to the very world they sought to impress. As the first guest whispered to another, and the flash of a camera illuminated the 1995 police file, I leaned into the microphone, my voice steady and cold, a senior systems architect delivering the final report on a corrupted family tree. The smell of the orchids felt suffocating now, a funeral scent for a reputation that was about to be buried under the weight of 3 offshore transfers of $21,666 each. I could see the panic in Eleanor's eyes as she realized the portfolio wasn't just a prop, but a curated museum of their felonies, each page a biological and financial proof of my abduction. I thought of the 34-degree sleet and the electronic lock, and I felt a grim satisfaction in knowing that the lock I was about to turn on them was one that no amount of money or influence could ever pick. The Founders Gala was intended to celebrate the origins of their wealth, but it was about to become the memorial service for their freedom, a public liquidation of a 31-year deception that had cost me my mother and had cost them their souls. I looked down at the grainy photo of Sarah Miller, the woman with my jawline, and I whispered a silent promise to her that the $65,000 silence was officially over, and that the daughter she had lost in a Denver clinic was the one who was finally bringing the fire to the Sterling's doorstep. The 65 guests stood like statues, their $300 meals forgotten, as the reality of the situation began to permeate the room, a slow-moving cloud of scandal that would soon be headline news across the state. I didn't need to shout or scream. The data spoke for itself, a cold and binary indictment of a high-end human trafficking deal that had been sanitized by the Sterling checkbook. Harrison took a step forward, his mouth opening as if to offer a bribe or a threat, but the sheer weight of the portfolio on the podium stopped him in his tracks, a physical manifestation of a debt that could only be paid in justice. This was the setup for the final act, the moment where the architect reveals the fatal flaw in the building's design just as the structure begins to lean. And as I looked out at the assembled elite of Weston, I knew that none of them would ever look at a baccarat crystal flute the same way again. The Sterling name was a corrupted file, and I was the one with the administrative privileges to hit the delete key, a 31-year process of restoration beginning with a single tap on a silver microphone. The local press photographer's flash went off again, a strobe light of reality that stripped away the glamour of the charcoal suit and the $5,000 flowers, leaving only the raw, undeniable truth of the kidnapping alert. I saw Skylar in the periphery, the golden child whose medical school had been paid for with the same currency used to buy my life, and I saw the confusion on her face as she realized that her entire existence was a luxury funded by a crime. The financial weapons, the spiritual coaching, and the performance reviews were all rendered irrelevant by the grainy black-and-white surveillance photo of a woman in Pittsburgh who had never stopped looking for her child. I was the arsenal, I was the hunter, and I was the senior systems architect who had finally found the point of no return. And as I opened my mouth to speak the first sentence of the Sterling's downfall, I felt the $84,000 in loans and the $1,200 fines dissolve into a singular, liberating purpose. The setup was complete, the audience was captive, and the $65,000 secret was about to become a matter of public record. A 65-guest lesson in the value of a stolen life that Eleanor and Harrison Sterling would never be able to manifesting their way out of. The silence that enveloped the sunken ballroom of the Weston estate was no longer the polite, anticipatory hush of an attentive audience. It was the suffocating, airless vacuum of a room that had just realized it was witnessing a social and legal execution. I stood behind the mahogany podium, my hands resting lightly on the cool leather of my $90 portfolio, feeling the immense, crushing weight of 31 years of manufactured gratitude finally shifting onto the shoulders of the two people who had purchased my life for the price of a mid-size SUV. I leaned into the silver neck of the microphone, my voice devoid of the shaky high notes of a victim and replaced instead with the resonant, terrifying clarity of a senior systems architect delivering a final terminal system audit. I addressed the 65 guests, the elite of Massachusetts who were currently digesting $300 a plate Wagyu beef, and I told them that before my so-called parents took credit for another act of philanthropic grandiosity, we needed to discuss their most significant and well-hidden investment, which was standing right in front of them. I didn't need to scream to be heard because the truth has its own frequency, one that pierces through the clinking of crystal and the scent of $5,000 floral arrangements with surgical precision. With a practiced movement, I reached into my charcoal power suit and activated the remote interface for the estate's $10,000 drop-down cinema screen, a high-end piece of equipment Harrison usually reserved for showing off his offshore investment portfolios and aerial footage of his summer home in Nantucket. The motorized screen descended with a slow, mechanical whir that sounded like a guillotine being readied, and as the 4K laser projector flickered to life, it didn't display family photos or charity milestones. Instead, it illuminated the room with the harsh, undeniable glare of 3 bank transfer receipts. Each receipt documented a wire of exactly $21,666.67, totaling the $65,000 purchase price of my existence, and I watched as the socialites leaned forward, their faces illuminated by the digital evidence of a transaction that turned a child into a commodity. I began to read from the Denver Missing Child Report, case number 95-482, my voice steady as I detailed the abduction of an infant named Maya Rossi from a clinic in Colorado, a child who had been systematically erased from the world so that she could be rebranded as Brielle Sterling. The room was so silent that I could hear the faint, erratic breathing of Genevieve as she stood at the foot of the dais, her $9,500 a month spiritual coaching failing to provide her with a single word of defense. I looked toward the back of the room at Harrison, whose aristocratic composure was disintegrating in real time, his face a mottled shade of ash as his $2,500 Breitling watch caught on the edge of a linen-draped table and hit the polished marble floor with a heavy, metallic clatter that felt like the final period on his legacy. He didn't reach down to retrieve it, and he didn't move to stop me, because at that moment, I wasn't just his daughter. I was the personification of every law he had broken and every life he had stepped on to maintain the illusion of the Sterling name. To seal the structural collapse of their defense, I tapped a command on my phone that triggered the audio system, filling the $4.2 million estate with the crackling, elderly voice of the retired nurse I had tracked down in a trailer park outside of Boulder. a woman whose conscience had finally been bought for a fraction of what Harrison had paid for her silence decades ago. The recording was a 3-minute confession, a detailed account of how a high-profile hedge fund manager had handed over a briefcase of cash in exchange for an infant with no paperwork, a child whose biological traces were to be incinerated to ensure the perfect, sterile adoption narrative. As the voice of the nurse echoed off the vaulted ceilings and the baccarat crystal flutes, I looked directly at the 65 guests and told them that they hadn't spent the last 3 decades watching a girl be raised by benevolent saviors. They had watched the management of a stolen asset, a high-end human trafficking deal sanitized by Weston property taxes and Ivy League tuition. I stepped away from the podium, moving toward the edge of the stage until I was looking down at Eleanor and Harrison, the people who had fined me $1,200 for being 14 minutes late while they owed a debt to the universe that they could never hope to repay. I told them with a cold, crystalline finality that the bill for 31 years of deception, for the theft of my mother's life, and for the psychological warfare they had waged against me was now due in full, and I was the one who had come to collect the interest. The financial gap they had used as a weapon, the $84,000 in student loans they refused to co-sign, and the $1,200 lessons in discipline were all nothing compared to the legal and social liquidation they were about to endure. I was no longer the grateful project or the charity case from the gutter. I was the architect of their total erasure, and as the local press photographer's flash captured the image of Harrison staring at the Denver police report on the big screen, I knew that by tomorrow morning, the sterling name would be synonymous with the $65,000 crime it was built upon. The moral of this execution is that you can buy a child, you can buy a nurse, and you can buy a narrative, but you can never truly delete the biological data of a human being's soul, especially when that soul belongs to a senior systems architect who knows how to find every hidden safe and every encrypted offshore account. Family isn't the name on the front of a Weston estate, and it isn't the people who demand gratitude for the air they let you breathe. Family is the truth that stays when the lights of the gala go out and the press begins to ask the questions you can't answer. I had spent my life trying to prove I was worthy of their love, but in that ballroom, I realized that I was the only person in the room who had any true worth, because I was the only one who wasn't a fraud. As I walked down the steps of the dais, the 65 guests parted like a receding tide, none of them daring to meet my eyes as I passed, their $300 meals sitting like lead in their stomachs as the realization of the scandal began to sink in. I left the black leather portfolio on the podium, a parting gift for the authorities I knew would be arriving within the hour, and I walked out of the main entrance of the house for the last time, not as Brielle Sterling, but as a woman who had finally reclaimed her own name. The night air was cold, a crisp 32 degrees that felt like a baptism after the suffocating, orchid-scented lies of the ballroom, and I stood on the cobblestone driveway looking at my 2024 Tesla, the silent, powerful machine that I had earned with my own talent and my own labor. I didn't look back at the frosted glass of the dining room or the flickering shadows of the gala guests, because I was no longer a part of that architecture. I had deconstructed the Sterling system and left it in a state of terminal failure, a corrupted file that could never be recovered. I thought about the woman in Pittsburgh, the real Maya Rossi's mother, and I felt a sense of peace that was more profound than any $9,500 spiritual manifestation could ever provide. I had used their money, their education, and their own security systems to destroy them. A poetic justice that required the same precision and focus I used to protect multi-billion-dollar networks from external threats. The Sterling legacy was a $65,000 lie that had been liquidated in front of 65 witnesses, and as I drove away from the Weston estate, I felt the weight of the 31 years of manufactured guilt lifting off my soul like a heavy winter fog. I was driving toward a future that wasn't dictated by performance reviews or Jimmy Choo standards of luxury, but by the raw, unvarnished truth of who I was and where I came from. The execution was complete, the system had crashed, and the administrator was finally logging out of a life that was never hers to begin with. I left Harrison and Eleanor standing in the wreckage of their $4.2 million colonial, two people who had spent a fortune to buy a daughter only to find out that you can't own a person who knows how to read the fine print of her own life. The bill was paid, the debt was settled, and for the first time in 31 years, I was no longer a stolen asset, but a free woman with a name that didn't belong to anyone but myself. As I reached the gates of the estate, I saw the blue and red lights of the first police cruisers reflecting off the fresh snow, a silent confirmation that the data I had exfiltrated was already doing its work in the real world. I didn't stop to talk to them. I had already provided all the evidence they needed in the $90 leather portfolio and the $20 encrypted USB drive I had left behind. My job as the architect of their downfall was finished, and my journey as a daughter of Maya Rossi was just beginning. I headed toward the highway, the city lights of Boston glowing on the horizon like a new beginning, and I realized that while the Sterlings had tried to teach me about discipline and the value of a dollar, the only lesson that mattered was the one I had just taught them. The truth is a system that can never be hacked, and when the bill finally comes due, not even a $4.2 million estate is enough to cover the cost of a stolen life. I was 31 years old, a senior systems architect with a salary of $182,000, and for the first time in my existence, I was exactly where I was supposed to be, moving at 85 miles per hour away from the ruins of a lie and toward the beautiful, terrifying reality of a truth that was finally mine to keep. The fallout from the Founders Gala was not a slow burn, but a localized nuclear detonation that leveled the Sterling name and reduced their $48 million social empire to a toxic wasteland within the span of a single news cycle. By the time the sun rose over the $4.2 million estate in Weston on Sunday morning, the iron gates were blocked by three black 2024 Chevrolet Suburban SUVs belonging to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and a phalanx of local news vans from every major network in New England. Harrison Sterling, the man who once managed $500 million with the casual indifference of a god, was escorted down his own cobblestone driveway in a pair of steel handcuffs, his face hidden behind the collar of a $2,000 overcoat as agents processed him for charges of kidnapping, interstate fraud, and the systematic falsification of federal adoption records. The $65,000 paper trail I had meticulously reconstructed proved to be an airtight roadmap for the Department of Justice, leading them directly to the offshore shell accounts and the digital ghosts of the clinic in Denver, where Maya Rossi's life had been traded for a wire transfer. Genevieve's carefully curated world of high-vibration spiritual coaching and quiet luxury vanished with a speed that was almost comedic, her social standing evaporating faster than the $12,000 worth of premium Botox she had injected into her forehead to maintain the mask of a benevolent mother. The women who had sat at her table sipping $190 Baccarat crystal flutes only 48 hours prior were the first to leak her private emails to the press, desperate to distance themselves from the woman who had essentially purchased a child to fill a gap in her social calendar. The 18-carat sapphire ring and the Loro Piana wraps were likely being cataloged as part of a massive asset seizure to cover the legal fees and the inevitable civil suits that would follow. Even Skylar, the biological golden child, found her $290,000 medical degree tainted by the revelation that it was funded by the interest on a stolen human life, leaving her to face the cold reality that the Sterling name was no longer a golden ticket, but a professional anchor dragging her into the depths of public infamy. As for me, I am currently sitting in the small, sun-drenched kitchen of a modest two-bedroom house in a quiet suburb of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, a home that costs less in total than the yearly maintenance on Harrison's Nantucket property, but feels infinitely more secure. Across from me sits a woman named Sarah Miller, a woman who has my exact jawline, the same arch in her eyebrow, and eyes that have spent the last 28 years reflecting a resilience I am only now beginning to understand. She showed me a stack of worn, translucent folders containing records of the 920 days of her life, She spent physically sitting in police stations, social service offices, and private investigators' waiting rooms, refused to be silenced by the legal phalanx the Sterlings had erected to keep her away from her daughter. She never stopped looking for Maya Rossi, even when she had only $42 in her bank account, and the entire world told her that her child was a cold case that would never be solved. Our dinner tonight bears no resemblance to the cold, transactional performances of the Weston estate. There is no $300 a plate catering, no 50-year-old Macallan Scotch, and certainly no $450 truffle-infused turkey served as a weapon of discipline. Instead, we are sharing a simple meal of homemade pasta and jarred sauce on mismatched ceramic plates, the steam from the pots fogging up the windows and creating a sanctuary of warmth that is built on the singular, unshakable foundation of the truth. There are no electronic smart locks keeping me out, and no $1,200 lessons in punctuality to be learned here. Only the quiet, profound sound of a mother and daughter learning the cadence of each other's voices after 3 decades of silence. The $84,300 in private student loans that I once thought was a noose around my neck has been integrated into a massive civil restitution claim against the Sterling Family Trust, a legal maneuver that will ensure Harrison and Genevieve pay for every cent of the education they used as a leash. The senior systems architect in me is still running the numbers, still analyzing the data of my own life, but the results are finally coming back clean, without the corrupted kernels of inherited shame or manufactured gutter heritage. I look at Sarah, and I see the 31 years that were stolen from us, but I also see the decades ahead where the Sterling name will never be spoken again, a period of restoration where the architecture of my identity is finally built on my own terms. The $5,000 floral arrangements in Weston were meant to celebrate a lie, but the single wilting daisy in a jelly jar on Sarah's kitchen table is a celebration of a survival that no amount of hedge fund money could ever extinguish. The moral of this final chapter is that family isn't the blood that is bought and sold in the dark corners of corrupt clinics, and it isn't the prestige found in a $4.2 million colonial. Family is the person who keeps the light on for 920 days, waiting for a ghost to walk through the door. The financial weapons the Sterlings used against me, the 2012 Toyota Corolla, the $400 Jimmy Choos, and the $9,500 spiritual manifestations, have all been liquidated in the court of public opinion, leaving them with nothing but the $65,000 receipt for their own downfall. I am no longer Brielle Sterling, the senior executive with a $182,000 salary and a debt of gratitude to criminals. I am Maya Rossi's daughter, and my worth is no longer a line item in Harrison's ledger. The truth has a way of deconstructing even the most sophisticated systems of deception, and as I sit here in this small house in Pennsylvania, listening to the rhythmic sound of my mother's laughter, I realize that the administrator of the Sterling collapse has finally found a home where she doesn't need root access to be loved. The bill has been paid in full, the asset has been reclaimed, and the Sterling name has been deleted from the registry of my soul, replaced by a heritage that was never in the gutter, but was always, always waiting for me to find my way back to the light. The evening light is fading over the Pittsburgh skyline, casting long, peaceful shadows across the linoleum floor, and for the first time in 31 years, the silence isn't a weapon or a punishment, but a shared comfort between two people who no longer have anything to hide. I think about the tart I left on the doorstep in the 34-degree sleet, and I realize it was the last transaction I would ever make with a family that viewed me as a $65,000 commodity. Out here, in the real world, value isn't measured in Baccarat crystal or Wagyu beef, but in the $90 portfolio that held the key to my freedom and the 920 days of a mother's unyielding hope. My name is no longer a brand or a project or a lesson in discipline. It is a living, breathing reality that belongs to the woman sitting across from me and the life we are finally allowed to begin. The Sterling era is over. The federal investigation is just beginning, and the only thing left of their legacy is the cold, hard data of a crime that could not withstand the architecture of the truth. I reached out and touched Sarah's hand, feeling the warmth of a biological connection that no DNA test could ever fully quantify. And I felt a sense of completion that no senior systems architect could ever code into a program. We aren't talking about the $48 million or the high-end human trafficking anymore. We are talking about the small things, the favorite colors and the childhood stories that were never told, the biological traces that were never truly incinerated. The Sterlings wanted to teach me about the power of money and the weight of a name, but Sarah Miller is teaching me about the power of presence and the weight of a promise kept across 3 decades and 2,000 miles. As I finish my meal and look out at the quiet street, I know that the 2024 Tesla in the driveway and the $182,000 salary are just tools I used to find my way here. But the destination was always this kitchen, this mother, and this undeniable truth. The bill is due, the Sterling name is toxic, and I am finally, irrevocably free.